On one side, a society operating with zero rules, descending into primal violence. On the other, an environment defined by total, unyielding order. In political theory, a reality without laws, courts, or governing bodies is known as absolute freedom. But this autonomy creates a fatal paradox. If you possess the unrestricted freedom to take whatever you want, every single person around you possesses the exact same freedom to take everything from you. Philosopher Thomas Hobbes observed this vulnerability and set out to find a structural solution. He determined that without a central authority to enforce rules, total liberty guarantees mutual destruction. Hobbes identified this theoretical starting point of humanity as the state of nature. He defined it as a condition of perpetual conflict, a war of every man against every man. This conflict is driven by biological necessity. Humans possess a restless drive to secure resources, maintain power, and ensure their own preservation. In an environment where everyone is competing for survival, human existence inevitably becomes, as Hobbes wrote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this baseline, humanity has to make a radical trade. They must willingly surrender their ultimate freedom to a supreme authority. The mechanism for this exchange is the social contract. Hobbes proposed a severe agreement. To function, individuals must yield all of their personal rights and autonomy to the state. In return for this total sacrifice, they receive one critical benefit: the absolute guarantee of physical security and societal order. The resulting supreme, unchallengeable authority is what Hobbes called the Leviathan. Look closely at the sovereign's anatomy. The state is not a separate entity. It is literally constructed from hundreds of individual citizens who have traded their autonomy to form the body of the ruler. Hobbes successfully engineered a necessary monster. He designed a system that trades liberty entirely for the guarantee of survival. But surviving under the rule of an absolute dictator is a low bar for human civilization. Philosopher John Locke evaluated Hobbes' model and rejected the requirement of absolute power. Locke argued that the legitimacy of the social contract rests entirely on the state's ability to protect inalienable natural rights, specifically life, liberty, and property. To enforce this, Locke built a failsafe into the contract. If the government breaches its duty to protect those rights, the agreement is voided, and the public gains the legitimate right to rebel. Jean-Jacques Rousseau expanded this framework further with the concept of a gating monster designed to keep us alive into a utilitarian tool that answers directly to the people. Every person alive today operates under a modern paradox. You were born into a binding social contract that you never explicitly signed. Yet this invisible agreement dictates the strict parameters of your daily reality, establishing the rules for taxation, property ownership, and civil liberties. Political science analyzes this continuous negotiation in real time. Elections, legislative battles, and protests are the physical mechanisms society uses to repeatedly adjust the balance between Hobbes' demand for security and Locke's liberty. While citizens have formed domestic states to escape chaos, no equivalent authority exists on the global stage. Nations have no central ruler. Instead, sovereign countries operate within a global state of nature. They interact in an anarchic international system without a global leviathan to enforce the rules. If nations exist in a state of absolute freedom, what prevents them from destroying one another? The struggle to balance autonomy and survival remains the permanent engine of human civilization, establishing the high-stakes reality of international relations. Observational. Steady. The British Parliament is a venue built for noise. It operates on raw, chaotic energy, a visible clashing of human political power in real time. In the Oval Office, that energy is channeled into a single point. The symmetry and isolation of the architecture project a heavy, singular authority. Both spaces represent the physical structures built to capture and direct power. To function at scale, a society builds a deliberate, rigid apparatus, a foundation designed to force raw political energy into predictable channels. The chaos of the legislative chamber and the silence of the executive office are the direct engineered outputs of how these containment structures are drafted. Political scientists study these structures through comparative politics. They treat these government models as blueprints that can be reverse engineered. This chart outlines the approach. It defines the comparative method as the systematic analysis of a small number of cases. By narrowing focus to a few regimes, researchers can trace how institutional rules dictate behavior. Because researchers cannot place entire nations into a laboratory, they use this method to test rival explanations. They look for solutions to having many variables across few cases. One primary tactic is the most similar systems design. Analysts compare two regimes that share almost every surface-level characteristic except for one critical structural choice. By isolating that single difference, researchers can identify specific mechanical failure points that cause a democracy to fall or a dictatorship to take hold. In democratic design, the parliamentary system is defined by a core mechanical feature, the fusion of power. The executive branch is not separate. It is generated directly from within the legislative majority. The prime minister and the cabinet are components of the parliament itself. This fusion prioritizes agility. When the executive and legislative majorities are identical, the system allows for the swift execution of policy. But the same connection creates a vulnerability. If the legislature loses confidence in the executive, the prime minister can be removed immediately, retracting back into the parliamentary bloc. The parliamentary blueprint trades executive independence for structural adaptability and constant accountability. The presidential system takes the opposite approach, utilizing a strict separation of powers. In this model, the executive and legislative branches are elected entirely independently. They exist in separate structural silos, both drawing their power from the same foundational electorate. This creates dual democratic legitimacy. Since both branches claim an independent mandate from the voters, the system is structurally prone to standoffs. When those mandates collide, the mechanics of the system dictate friction. It is designed to produce gridlock when the separate branches disagree. This design prevents rapid, impulsive shifts in policy, but it leaves the government vulnerable to operational paralysis. The presidential blueprint engineers stability through tension, valuing the prevention of centralized power over the speed of governance. Authoritarian regimes are not lawless states. They operate within a highly engineered architecture. Most autocracies maintain standard institutions. They have courts, legislatures, and media bureaus that look identical to those in democracies. The difference is in the wiring. Instead of acting as outward checks on power, these institutions are rerouted inward to insulate the leader. They form a shell that protects the executive note from accountability. Even elections are weaponized. They are used to mathematically map the opposition and project legitimacy, while state gears work to suppress actual competition. These regimes represent the systematic weaponization of the state's blueprint, using standard institutional components to consolidate power against the citizenry. Governments are not natural occurrences. They are artificial constructs, designed and maintained by human choice. Comparative politics shows a nation's trajectory depends less on individual leaders and more on institutional design. Changing a single structural rule, like an electoral threshold, creates a ripple effect determining if a state remains stable or descends into conflict. Ultimately, these massive institutional blueprints govern the economies, the borders, and the everyday physical freedoms of billions of people. Political power is only as legitimate, and a society only as stable as the engineered grid built to contain it. Look at a map of modern governance, and you are looking at the aftermath of thousands of intersecting crises and decisions. It is a scattered landscape where some nations stabilize into robust democracies, while others fracture into authoritarianism. If a physicist wants to understand gravity, they can drop a weight in a vacuum. They can isolate the environment. But researchers studying the collapse of states or the origins of war cannot place human societies in a laboratory to observe what happens. Instead, the political scientist works backward. They observe the residue of real-world events and deduce the chain of cause and effect that produce them. Since we cannot generate artificial history under controlled conditions, we must find a way to filter the chaotic noise of history into testable empirical evidence. Attempting to filter that noise immediately introduces a mathematical paradox that threatens to make traditional analysis impossible. In comparative politics, researchers face a hard ceiling on data. There are fewer than 200 sovereign countries on Earth, the absolute maximum of testable cases. But inside each country, millions of unique historical, cultural, geographic, and economic factors interact at once. Standard statistical methods rely on large sample sizes to test specific variables. When the number of explanatory factors vastly outnumbers the actual cases you can observe, a standard regression model becomes mathematically useless. In 1971, Aaron Leibhardt explicitly laid out this methodological nightmare, formally defining the quandary of many variables small n. He observed a strict mathematical reality. As explanatory factors approach the number of available cases, the capacity to adjudicate among explanations through statistical comparison rapidly diminishes. To maintain rigor as a science, the discipline had to invent a structural logic capable of bypassing the math entirely, the compariness method. The first structural solution to the small n problem is a mechanism designed to create a substitute for experimental control. Conceptually, it is the equivalent of searching for a needle in two identical haystacks. Researchers select two countries sharing exact background variables, matching geography, parallel histories, and similar wealth. Despite being twins, they experience opposite outcomes. One becomes a democracy, the other a dictatorship. By holding the background constant, the single differing variable must be the cause. Scholars Adam Przeworski and Henry Toon advocated for this specific strategic matching, formally labeling it most similar systems design. It isolates the active trigger of political change by deliberately canceling out the shared background noise. However, even identical countries possess subtle differences. This introduces the risk of overdetermination, where researchers are left with multiple rival explanations and no clear criteria to choose among them. When similar systems fail to yield a single answer, political scientists invert the entire strategy. Instead of comparing identical subjects with different outcomes, they deploy the most different systems design to find a common thread among totally unrelated subjects. Researchers select wildly diverse nations from different continents with completely different economies and cultures. Despite having nothing in common, they look for convergence, nations experiencing the exact same political event. Tracing this process across different contexts, the single surviving common variable identifies the causal relationship. Most different systems design proves causation by demonstrating that a specific variable produces the same political outcome regardless of a nation's cultural or economic background. When we return to the macro perspective, the investigator's dilemma begins to resolve. Events that appear chaotic in isolation reveal recurring structural patterns. By oscillating between most similar and most different designs, researchers can cross-verify their hypotheses. One method isolates the trigger, the other confirms it works across diverse environments, eliminating false positives. This logical framework elevates political analysis from subjective opinion into rigorous, systematic deduction. Modern researchers utilize these frameworks within comparative historical analysis, successfully balancing deep regional context with broad, systematic causal testing. Under this lens, major political events, like the outbreak of wars, revolutions, or regime collapses, are not isolated accidents, but outcomes that can be traced back to these isolatable variables. By using the comparative method to decode historical patterns, we develop the tools to understand the mechanics behind our current political landscape. When you step into a voting booth, the environment is designed for quiet. The curtain closes, the noise fades, and the act of marking a ballot feels like an exercise in pure, autonomous choice. Every mark on that paper exists within a network of massive aggregated forces, linking the individual to the broader movements of the state. No one is born with a partisan affiliation. We do not arrive in the world with innate preferences for tax policies, trade tariffs, or regulatory frameworks. This private decision functions as the endpoint of a lifelong, invisible process of environmental conditioning. Political scientists refer to this process as political socialization. It is the invisible mechanism through which individuals absorb the norms, values, and cultural baselines of their surrounding society. The groundwork is laid early. Family dynamics and early childhood education quietly establish our initial orientations toward authority, justice, and civic duty, long before we can even define those terms. Later, secondary environments intervene. Peer groups, higher education, and workplace cultures either reinforce those early baselines or introduce friction that forces a recalibration of our worldview. To understand how these inputs shape human behavior, researchers rely on comparative methodology. As this text outlines, systematically comparing a small number of specific cases allows political scientists to isolate which environmental factors are actually driving behavior, turning abstract human experiences into measurable data. Once you map this socialization process, the concept of the entirely neutral voter disappears. Our minds are wired by external structures, well before we engage in the political system. If our environments are so effective at socializing us to care about specific issues, why do so many critical causes fail to generate a public response? The answer lies in the collective action dilemma. This is the structural friction that occurs anytime the incentives of the individual misalign with the goals of the larger group. Participating in a mass movement requires tangible sacrifice, lost wages, physical exhaustion, or legal risk. Yet, if a movement succeeds, the resulting policy changes benefit everyone, regardless of who actually showed up to demand them. Inaction represents a mathematically rational response to these systemic costs. This creates a specific vulnerability known as the free rider problem, the logical temptation to let others do the heavy lifting while still reaping the rewards of their labor. Consider this model of a 100-person community. Everyone here agrees a new policy is necessary, but no one wants to absorb the initial cost of organizing the protest. If one person stays home, they avoid the personal cost of acting, while knowing their single absence will not mathematically doom a 99-person demonstration. However, because everyone is performing this exact same rational calculus simultaneously, the defections compound. The logic cascades through the population, and the movement collapses before it ever begins. When political scientists study these cascading failures, they look for structural patterns. As this methodological text details, analyzing why collective action stalls requires researchers to artificially reduce the number of explanatory variables to locate the core mathematical driver of the behavior. Without an external mechanism to override this rational hesitation, the public good is routinely abandoned, leaving the crowd permanently silent. If human behavior defaults to rational inaction, how does any mass political mobilization ever materialize? Historically, this hurdle is cleared by media gatekeepers. They operate as the institutional override to the collective action dilemma. Gatekeepers provide this synchronized signal, telling millions of isolated people to care about the exact same issue simultaneously. This shared broadcast alters the math of participation. By proving millions of others receive the same urgency, the signal assures individuals they aren't acting alone, dramatically lowering the risk of joining in. Without a central authority setting that unified agenda, coordinating national action becomes structurally impossible. But this system relies entirely on a monopoly of attention. Today, that centralized signal has shattered. Instead of a single organizing narrative, modern networks produce an endless stream of contradictory signals. The consensus required for action is buried under digital noise. As the shared reality fragments, the assurance that others will stand with you evaporates. Without that trust, the math reverts back to its baseline, and individuals retreat back into rational apathy. Which brings us back to the silence of the voting booth. Our political choices are never made in isolation. They are the fragile result of a constant tug-of-war between the environments that socialize our psychology, the mathematical friction of collective action, and the institutions fighting to write our shared script. Inside the borders of a functioning country, if someone steals your property or threatens your life, you can dial 911. A police force, backed by a legal system, arrives. But step outside those borders, into the global arena, and that emergency line goes dead. Political scientists call this environment international anarchy. This does not mean the world is constantly engulfed in chaos. It simply means there is no global sovereign government, no worldwide police force with the authority to protect a state if it gets attacked. This structural void forces a difficult question. If a nation is threatened and there is no higher authority to call for help, how does it guarantee its own survival? The immediate psychological result is a state of constant, rational paranoia. A country cannot know for sure what its neighbors are planning, today or 10 years from now. Without a global referee, states are forced to prepare for the worst-case scenarios. Assuming your neighbors might turn hostile becomes the baseline requirement for staying alive. This calculation of survival forms the basis of realism, the oldest theoretical lens in international relations. Realists argue that because states operate in fear, their only rational move is to maximize their own military and economic power. This perspective dates back to ancient Greece. The historian Thucydides documented the brutal logic of statecraft in the Melian dialogue, observing that in the absence of a higher law, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Realism suggests a mechanical cycle of conflict. When a rising power expands its influence, it aggressively intersects with an established power. This dynamic is the Thucydides trap. The two powers become a locked gear mechanism, unable to advance without violently grinding against one another. If this calculation is absolute, humanity is locked into a deterministic cycle. Under strict realism, peace is simply the temporary pause while rival nations reload their weapons. Yet, if the strict realist calculation of continuous paranoid power-grabbing were the only truth, the globe would be locked in uninterrupted total war. Instead, we see long periods of peace and vast networks of trade. This brings us to liberalism. This theoretical framework examines how human beings actively build cooperative structures to mitigate the fear generated by global anarchy. This diagram highlights the primary mechanism that alters the math of war: economic interdependence. By establishing golden nodes of trade lines across borders, attacking another state risks severing your own supply chains, triggering a cascading economic collapse that damages your markets just as severely as your targets. This shared vulnerability creates a massive financial disincentive for conflict. A state ties its own survival and prosperity directly to the stability of its rivals. Liberalism does not erase the underlying fear of an ungoverned world. It engineers a system where maintaining cooperation yields higher returns than attempting military conquest. States operationalize this economic and political cooperation by drafting formal treaties and establishing international institutions. Human-made architectures, like this massive tiered assembly hall of the United Nations, serve as physical spaces for dialogue. They act as proxy referees to mediate disputes before they escalate into violence. These agreements require active human agency. Sovereign nations voluntarily surrender small amounts of their own autonomy, actively signing on to shared rules to secure collective stability. While these organizations lack the enforcement power of a true global government, they succeed in establishing powerful norms that regulate how states behave on the world stage. By building this robust architecture of rules, liberalism proves war is a choice. The mechanical trap of conflict can be successfully managed, mediated, and delayed. Both realism and liberalism share a core assumption that states are fixed, objective entities reacting to an external environment. They suggest that any nation placed in the same position would behave exactly like a billiard ball reacting to a strike. Constructivism challenges this by looking at the internal identity of the state itself. It argues that a nation's history, culture, and relationships determine how it perceives the anarchy around it. As political scientist Alexander Wendt famously stated, "Anarchy is what states make of it." Under this lens, the definitions of enemy or ally are not fixed. As you see here, rigid borders dissolve into a shifting web of connections. For example, the United States views 500 British nuclear weapons as a sign of security, but 5 North Korean weapons as an existential threat. The difference isn't the physics of the warhead, it's the social relationship between the nations. If the rules of the international system are built on these shared perceptions, then shifting our collective beliefs redefines the nature of global interaction. Constructivism places responsibility back on human agency. The global system is a product of our own making, subject to our own revisions. Stepping back from the metaphorical chessboard reveals the singular, actual arena of human existence, suspended in the dark void of space. From this vantage point, the lack of a central global government is an open, continuously evolving canvas. The borders that define international anarchy are invisible. The future of international relations is not dictated by mechanical cycles of violence. It is determined by the shared identities, beliefs, and norms we collectively choose to build.